They say boundaries are clear, that you know exactly when you're about to cross one. But I've learned that's not always true. I'm 42 years old. I've been teaching literature at the same university for 13 years. I'm married. I have a daughter in high school. From the outside, my life looks solid, stable, even admirable. But the inside has been slowly cracking for years. My husband and I barely talk anymore, unless it's about bills or dinner plans. We sleep in the same bed, but we might as well live in different time zones. There's no fighting, no drama, just silence. And then came Liam. He was a third-year student in my contemporary literature class, 23 years old, bright, articulate. He sat in the second row, always took notes, and always stayed a few minutes after class, just long enough to ask a thoughtful question or offer a quiet opinion. At first, I saw it as dedication, a sign that maybe my teaching was still reaching someone. Then came the emails. He'd ask for reading suggestions, send me drafts of essays he hadn't been assigned. He was curious, hungry, and I loved that. I loved feeling seen. One afternoon, he waited until all the students had left. He stood by the desk, holding a novel I'd recommended. "You know," he said, "no one's ever made me want to read like this." I laughed, brushed it off, but my stomach flipped. I should have created distance, but I didn't. Instead, I offered to review one of his writing projects in more depth. We agreed to meet during office hours. Then we started meeting outside of them, coffee shops, then walks, then sitting together on the campus steps after sunset. We never touched, not then. But the tension, the closeness, was electric. He started opening up to me about his family, his loneliness, his past, and I started doing the same, about my fading marriage, the ache I carried but never spoke of. The night it happened, we were at a bookstore event downtown. I'd invited him, part of a student enrichment thing, nothing suspicious. We left around 10 p.m. It was raining. I offered him a ride. When we got to his place, he turned to me and said, "You're the only person who sees me." He leaned in. I didn't stop him. We kissed. And then, everything blurred. I won't pretend I was swept away or confused. I knew what I was doing. I just didn't stop. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It felt like warmth after years of cold. But afterward, the moment he fell asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, knowing I had done something that couldn't be undone. I left before sunrise. He messaged me the next day. I didn't reply. For 2 weeks, I avoided him completely. But I still saw him, in class, in hallways. And when he looked at me, I saw pain, confusion, something breaking. Eventually, he stopped showing up. I heard from another professor that he transferred out of my class, and a few weeks later, he dropped out entirely. I never saw him again. I told no one, not my husband, not my colleagues, no one, but I carry it. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder, was I helping him feel seen? Or was I using him to feel alive? Did I shatter his trust in mentors forever? I don't know. But I think about him. Still. And sometimes I imagine what he'd say if we crossed paths again. Would he hate me? Would he forgive me? Or would he just look through me, like I was someone he never really knew? Weeks passed. I kept teaching. I kept pretending. I smiled in the hallways, graded papers, attended faculty meetings. But inside, I was crumbling. It's strange how the body can go through the motions while the soul sits still, stuck in the memory of a single night. Every time I looked at the desk where Liam used to sit, I felt the ache. Not of guilt, not just guilt, but of absence. His presence had filled something in me, and now the emptiness was louder than ever. One afternoon, a package arrived in my campus mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside, a thin black notebook, handwritten. It was Liam's, a journal or fragments of one. Dozens of half-finished thoughts, questions, and one recurring phrase. She was the only one who saw me, and she couldn't even look at me after. I closed the book. My hands were shaking. It wasn't just what he wrote. It was how much of me I saw in his words. I was no longer a mentor. I had become someone else entirely in his story. A ghost, a regret, maybe even a wound. I kept the notebook hidden in a drawer at home, and that's when everything else began to unravel. At dinner one evening, my husband looked up from his plate and said, "You've been somewhere else lately. You disappear without leaving the room." I brushed it off, told him I was just tired, but something in his eyes told me. He didn't believe that. Later that week, he found the notebook, not because I left it out, because he had started looking. He didn't say anything at first. He just placed it on the kitchen table and sat across from me. "You want to tell me what this is?" My mouth went dry. I didn't lie. I didn't try to twist it. I told him the truth. All of it. He listened, silently, rigid. When I finished, he asked one question. "Why?" I opened my mouth, closed it. Because how do you explain the kind of loneliness that makes you betray everything you've built? How do you explain that you felt alive again and disgusted at the same time? I told him the truth. I felt seen, and I didn't want to disappear again. He left that night, and though he came back a few days later to pack some things, the damage was done. We separated 2 weeks later, quietly, without lawyers, without screaming. I told our daughter he got a job in another city. She was old enough to see through the lie, but kind enough not to press. Months went by. My lectures became colder, tighter, more mechanical. I no longer stayed after class. I no longer smiled at students in the halls. Something in me had shut down, not out of punishment, but out of fear. I couldn't let anyone close again. Not because I feared temptation, but because I feared what version of myself might surface next. Then, one winter morning, I opened my email to find a message. From Liam. "I'm okay now. I'm not writing to blame you. I just wanted you to know I don't hate you. I needed to hate you for a while to protect myself, but I don't anymore. I hope you're healing too." I cried, not because I felt forgiven, but because I realized I'd spent all this time trying to erase something I couldn't, when maybe, just maybe, I had to learn how to carry it instead. I never replied. Some stories don't need sequels. Some mistakes don't need explanations. But I kept the email, along with the notebook, and the ring I stopped wearing, and the quiet, stubborn reminder that I'm not who I used to be. I still teach, but I teach differently now, with boundaries, with honesty, with caution, and sometimes with tears I can't explain. Because the truth is this: I crossed a line, and no matter how far I walk beyond it, I'll always see it behind me. They always tell you where the line is. Don't sleep with your student, don't flirt, don't get too personal, and I didn't. At least, not at first. My name is Rachel. I'm 39. I've been teaching creative writing for almost a decade. I have a husband who loves logic more than poetry, a teenage son who barely speaks to me unless he needs something, and a life that, on paper, is full. But in truth, I was starving for something I couldn't even name. Then I met Caleb. He sat in the back of my Wednesday evening workshop, always quiet, always listening, the kind of student who didn't raise his hand often, but when he did, the room went still. His writing was dark, raw, unpolished, but real. At first, I kept my distance. He was 24, ex-military. Had that heavy, still energy of someone who'd seen too much and didn't trust easily. One night after class, he waited until the other students left. Then he said, "Can I ask you something? Do you ever teach beyond this?" I didn't understand at first. "Like tutoring?" I asked. He shook his head. "I mean, do you ever work one-on-one with students who really want to learn?" It was bold. Too bold. But part of me didn't hate it. I told him to email me. That I'd think about it. That email came 2 hours later. Short, respectful, but layered with something else. A current. I said yes. At first, our meetings were just that. Meetings. We discussed character arcs, structure, voice. He brought stories that made my skin prickle. They were good. Too good. He told me he'd never felt like he belonged anywhere until he started writing. And somehow, I started telling him things I'd never told anyone. About how I used to write, before the marriage, before the child, before I shrank into a version of myself that fit inside a syllabus. He made me feel awake again. Then came the night we stayed after too long. Everyone had gone. The building was quiet. He was reading something I'd written, something personal, something I hadn't shown anyone in years. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "You write like someone who's begging to be seen." And then, he touched my hand, just lightly, just for a second. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling, trying to erase the feeling of Caleb's fingers on mine. I told myself I'd end the tutoring. I didn't. We started meeting at a cafe instead of campus. Then, one Saturday, he asked if I wanted to see the short film he was working on. I said yes. It was at his apartment, and I knew what I was walking into. I watched the film. I praised it. He leaned in. I didn't stop him. We kissed. And then everything blurred. I remembered the details like flashes. My shirt on the floor. His breath on my neck. The way he looked at me like I was something sacred and dangerous. I left before dawn, sick with fear, with guilt, with something that felt like longing and loathing all at once. I told him it couldn't happen again. He agreed. We never spoke of it. But we kept meeting. The conversations changed, got colder, tighter, more distant, until he just stopped showing up. He dropped the class, then the program. I emailed once. No reply. Months later, I saw a post on a writing forum. His name. A story. One that mirrored ours so closely it felt like being skinned alive. It wasn't about a professor. Not exactly. But it was about a woman who forgot who she was. Until it was too late. It won an award. And I haven't written a word since. There's a version of me I keep hidden. The one who knows what I did. My name is Elena. I'm 41. I teach philosophy at a quiet private university on the East Coast. I've been married for 16 years. We have one child, a boy, now 12. From the outside, my life is controlled, calm, even enviable. But under the surface, I was slowly suffocating. I stopped writing years ago, stopped laughing without reason, stopped feeling anything except the dull ache of routine. Then came Julian. He walked into my lecture hall one chilly Monday morning, sat in the front row, and didn't take his eyes off me the entire hour. I remember thinking, he's too intense, too present, too awake for an 8 a.m. class. He started asking questions. Good ones. Questions that made me rethink my own syllabus. He wasn't like the other students. He wasn't loud or cocky. He was quiet, thoughtful, sharp. He began coming to office hours. Not often, not suspiciously, but regularly enough that I noticed. He'd talk about ethics, about Greek texts, about Nietzsche's contradictions. and somehow always circle back to something more personal. Not inappropriate, just intimate. He once said, "You speak like someone who's lived more than she lets on." And I laughed. But it stuck. Because I had. I just hadn't felt it in years. The first time it shifted was during midterms. He'd submitted a paper. Brilliant, nuanced, original. I gave him an A. He came in to discuss it, but stayed to talk about poetry. I told him I used to write. He asked to read something. I said no. The next day, a small printed poem was slid under my door. It was about hunger and silence, and someone who couldn't say what they needed to say. I didn't sleep that night. Over the following weeks, the boundaries blurred. He started walking with me after class, bringing coffee to my office, slipping quotes into conversation that felt like messages meant only for me. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. Because for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel invisible. One night, after a guest lecture on existentialism, we stayed behind to clean up. The room emptied. The hallway was dark. I was leaning over a table, gathering papers, when I felt him behind me. Not touching, just close. And he said, "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I think about you more than I should." I turned, looked into his eyes, and I didn't say anything. We didn't kiss. Not then. But it was the beginning. The night it happened, I had no excuse, no whine, no pressure, no external reason. I invited him to my house. My husband was away with our son for the weekend, visiting family. It was just meant to be a conversation. I told myself that. But when I opened the door and saw him, tall, eyes like storm clouds, holding the book I once said I loved, I knew I wouldn't stop anything. We talked, for hours, about literature, about his past, about my regrets. And then he reached out, touched my face, and kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't lustful. It was heartbreakingly slow. The kind of kiss that asks, "Are you sure?" And I was. That night was both everything and too much. He slept in my bed. My husband sighed. And in the morning, we lay in silence for nearly an hour. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "This can't happen again, can it?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know. But it didn't happen again. I ended it the next day, sent him an email, told him we'd crossed a line, that I had to protect him, that I was sorry. He didn't reply. He dropped the class. He avoided my building. He erased himself from my daily life, but not from my memory. A year passed. I tried to forget, to forgive myself. Then, one afternoon, I saw him, at a cafe across town, with a girl his age. They were laughing. He looked free. And I realized something. I had hurt him, but I hadn't destroyed him. That was my punishment, and my relief. I still teach. I still come home to a family that doesn't know what I carry. But sometimes I drive past that cafe, or reread the poem he left under my door. And I wonder, was I just another lesson he had to unlearn? Or was I the one who learned too late? That feeling seen is not worth becoming someone you can't respect. It's been 3 years since I last saw Julian. 3 years since that night. The one I can't forget and can't talk about. And yet, his presence hasn't left me. It lingers, not in my bed, not in my home, but in the person I became after everything fell apart. Because yes, everything did fall apart. It didn't happen all at once. My husband never found out, not in the traditional sense. There was no dramatic confrontation, no divorce papers, no screaming matches in the kitchen. What happened was worse. He felt it. The absence, the coldness, the way I flinched when he touched me, the way I stared out windows for too long. And one evening, over dinner, he simply said, Are you in love with someone else? I froze. The question wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was hollow. I said, no. And in that moment, I wasn't lying. Not exactly. I wasn't in love. I was drowning in guilt, memory, confusion, but not love. He nodded, quietly, and we didn't speak about it again. But something shifted between us after that. He stopped trying, and I stopped pretending. We lived like roommates, like people politely waiting for each other to fall asleep first. In the spring that followed, my university announced a routine faculty review, anonymous feedback, teaching evaluations, classroom observations. I didn't worry until a letter arrived in my inbox. Anonymous, untraceable, not from the official system. It said, "You think no one noticed, but we did. Professors don't look at students like that. We all saw it. And he's gone. Why are you still here?" My hands shook as I deleted it. I told myself it was someone guessing, someone bitter, someone assuming. But I couldn't unsee the truth behind the words. I had looked at him like that, and someone had noticed. After that, I stopped sleeping properly. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., stare at the ceiling, and replay everything. Every step I should have stopped. Every line I blurred. Every moment I excused. And I'd think about Julian. Where was he now? Still writing? Still haunted? Still thinking of me? Or relieved to be free of my shadow? One night, I drove to the part of the city where I knew he used to go. A late-night bookstore, a quiet tea shop on the corner. I parked, Saturday waited. He didn't come. Of course not. I wasn't the main character in his life. I was a footnote, a warning, a chapter he'd outgrown. Months later, something happened that shattered me, quietly, without warning. My son, now 15, came home with a writing assignment. He asked me to read it. It was a fictional story about a young man and his teacher. Not inappropriate, but painfully familiar. The story was about emotional confusion. How hard it is when you admire someone so much that you can't tell the difference between love and need. At the end of the story, the young man leaves, not out of anger, but self-preservation. I asked my son, "Did you come up with this yourself?" He said, "Not exactly. I read something online once, about a teacher and a student. I don't know why it stuck with me, and I had to excuse myself from the room, because somehow my story had spread. It wasn't just mine anymore. It was out there, reimagined, fictionalized, but alive. The university never launched a formal investigation. There was no evidence. Julian never came forward. No one reported anything directly. But I knew the whispers were there. Some colleagues stopped talking to me. Some students stopped trusting me. One by one, I felt the walls close in. I requested a sabbatical. It was granted, no questions asked. And quietly, I disappeared from campus. Now I live outside the city, in a small, rented cabin near the coast. I don't teach. I don't write. I take long walks. I read more poetry than I used to. And sometimes, I speak aloud to the wind, saying the things I never got to say to Julian. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that version of me. I wish I had been stronger." And then, I go back inside, make tea, and sit in the quiet. My husband and I separated 2 years ago, not with a bang, just with the slow, inevitable unraveling of people who were never brave enough to speak the full truth. My son visits sometimes. He doesn't know what I did, but he sees the sadness in me. And one day, he asked, "Are you okay, Mom? You always seem like you're trying to disappear." And I didn't answer, because in many ways, I already had. There's a moment that plays in my mind more often than I'd like. It's not the kiss, not the night, not even the goodbye. It's that first conversation. Julian, sitting across from me, asking, "Do you ever feel like you're living the wrong version of your life?" And me, smiling like it was just a philosophical question, when really it was the beginning of everything. Now, when people ask me who I used to be, I tell them, I was a teacher. Then I became a story. Now I'm just a woman who's learning how to live with silence.